After 31 days in the hospital because of a stroke that nearly took my life, I came home to find my key no longer worked. The door had been changed to a fingerprint lock, a camera aimed straight at my face as if I were a stranger. The door swung open and my son's father-in-law stood there, wearing my wife's jacket, my late wife's jacket, sipping coffee from a familiar mug, then dropping exactly one ice-cold line: "You're no longer stable enough to live here." In that moment, I understood they had not only locked me out of my house, they were erasing me from my own life. If you have ever seen someone pushed out of their own life by the very people who were supposed to stand by them, and tell me where you are listening to this story from. And if you want to continue walking alongside stories where justice does not need to shout, yet still has the strength to stand upright, I sincerely appreciate and am grateful for your subscription. Please allow me to tell my story. 31 days in the hospital is enough time for a person to relearn things they never thought they would have to relearn. Getting out of bed without dizziness, lifting a cup without spilling it, and standing straight under fluorescent lights without feeling the room tilt. When I left the rehabilitation ward, the morning was so gray that the New Hampshire sky looked like a sheet of worn metal. The rain fell fine, soundless, clinging to the car windows in long, blurred streaks. The nurse wheeled me to the door, rereading the medication doses, follow-up schedule, and a few familiar instructions. The doctor said, "Minor stroke?" His voice as even as when signing a report. I nodded, not because I was fully well, but because I believed that once I got home, everything would fall back into place. The taxi drove along Ashford Lake. The tires sliced through a thin layer of water on the road, the soft rustling sound steady like a breath. I looked out the window. The lake's surface was dull gray, lightly rippled by the wind. The pine trees along the shore leaned at a familiar angle, the angle I once calculated when choosing where to lay the foundation of the house. I had traveled this road countless times, when I was healthy, when Eleanor was still alive, when I personally laid each stone for the entry path. The feeling of almost home should have been warm and solid, but that day it was thinner than usual, as if it too knew it was about to betray me. The taxi stopped at the gate. I paid. My fingertips were still numb, but steady enough that the bill did not slip. The driver opened the door and looked at me with the eyes of someone accustomed to bringing people to places they believe are safe. I stepped out. The rain immediately soaked the hem of my pants. The smell of wet earth, pine resin, the lake, everything was familiar. The Ashford Lake Villa stood before me, nearly unchanged. Wooden siding, a sloped roof, a row of large windows facing the water. In form, it was still the house I built, but some things do not need to be smashed to make it clear that you have been pushed out of your own story. On the wooden post to the right of the gate, where there had once only been a motion sensor light, a new camera was now mounted. Small, dark, cold. It glinted under the rain like an unblinking eye. The wiring was concealed so carefully that if I had not been the one who drew the electrical plans for this house, I might not have noticed. When I stepped up one stair, the camera turned slightly. No sound, no warning, just a silent acknowledgement. Someone is approaching and that someone needs to be watched. I lifted the brass key out of habit and then froze. The front door no longer had a mechanical lock. Where the old handle had been was now a new unit, matte black, with a fingerprint reader and a thin strip of light. I stood there for a few seconds. 31 days earlier, when the ambulance took me away, this door still recognized me. I clearly remembered closing it, tapping lightly on the wood, a foolish habit of someone who believed in solid structures. Now the door stood there like an unfeeling surface, no longer knowing who I was. I tried entering the old code. No response. I tried another sequence, the one only Eleanor and I had used when contractors came by. Same result. I placed my finger on the reader. Cold. The light strip flashed once and went dark. A dry beep sounded, brief, like a refusal already prepared. The humiliation was not in the door refusing to open. It was the fact that I understood immediately that this was no mistake. Someone had replaced me with a system. Someone had decided my return was a risk that needed to be locked out. I looked around the house to the left, where Mr. Anderson once asked me to check the wooden bridge over the small stream. I had stood there, pointing out which beam needed reinforcing, saying that if it wasn't done, winter freezing would cause cracks. He had shaken my hand and thanked me like family. Today his curtain shifted slightly. A face appeared, then the curtain closed. Not rushed, not panicked. A polite kind of avoidance, as if they had been told in advance it was best not to get involved. Farther away, a woman was walking her dog. She looked straight at me. Then, when she saw me standing at my own door, she tilted her head, weighing something, then turned away. The dog tugged on the leash, wanting to come closer. She pulled back, murmuring something under her breath. I couldn't hear it, but I understood. A distance had been erected out of whispers. I called Nathaniel. It rang, then dropped into voicemail. I called again. No answer. I called Brooke. Same thing. The rain clung to my hair in tiny beads. I wasn't shaking from the cold. I was shaking from the sensation of being pushed to the margins of my own life without a single official notice. I lifted my head and looked straight into the camera. I knew it was recording, and in that moment, I understood. They wanted this frame. They wanted me standing awkwardly in front of my own house, looking like an old man just discharged from the hospital who had the wrong address. Humiliation, in its most refined form, needed no laughter. It only needed perfect timing. I stepped aside, intending to circle to the side door, the one I used when carrying lumber into storage, when dragging toolboxes into the workshop behind the house. But just then, the front door opened. Not Nathaniel, not Brooke. Howard Beckett stood blocking the way. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver hair neatly combed, the posture of a man accustomed to standing as the homeowner. What caught in my throat was not his face, but the charcoal wool coat he was wearing. Eleanor's coat. I recognized it instantly because I had taken it to be altered at the cuffs when Eleanor lost weight in her final year. I had held that coat, smelled her faint perfume on it, and thought no one else would ever wear it. Now it rested on another man's shoulders like a wordless declaration. Howard looked me up and down, no anger, no hostility, just a calm assessment, like someone deciding whether an object was still usable. He opened the door just enough, not inviting me in, not closing it either, a precise gesture of boundaries. "You're back," he said, his voice low, as if saying it was sufficient in itself. I looked at the coat, at his hand on the doorframe, at the warm yellow light behind him. My house, the familiar smell of coffee, but no longer for me. "The lock's been changed," I said. My voice sounded unfamiliar. "Yes," Howard replied, "for safety." Safety for whom? He looked at me longer as if the question were naive. Then he said the line I knew would stay with me for a long time. "You're no longer stable enough to live here?" No insults, no threats. Just a label pressed squarely onto my forehead, in front of the camera, in front of the neighbors, in front of the house I built. Not stable enough, a phrase that sounded reasonable, humane, like medical advice, and because of that, it was the perfect excuse to strip rights away. I inhaled, my lungs working harder than usual. "Who gave you the right to stand at the door of my house?" Howard tilted his head. For the first time, I saw a flicker of pity in his eyes, the toxic kind, meant to make the other person shrink. "Eleanor arranged many things before she passed," he said. "Nathaniel is just doing what needs to be done." Eleanor's name flared in my mind like a spark. I saw the kitchen years ago when she placed a stack of papers on the dining table and asked me to sign. She said it was to keep things orderly, so no one would argue later. I signed without reading closely because I trusted the woman who had lived with me for nearly 40 years. I remembered her hand resting on mine, her gentle voice. I had a lawyer prepare it. Malcolm Pierce. The name flickered like a pinprick. I remembered him sitting in the living room, talking about a trust as if it were an invisible fence. I had listened without asking much. Standing at the door now, I understood. Those papers had not just been about order. They were a safety latch Eleanor left behind, and someone was now using the very word safety to keep me outside. Howard pulled the door halfway closed. "You should go rest," he said. "Don't make things worse." I didn't knock again. I watched the narrowing gap, watched Eleanor's coat disappear behind the wood, and heard the electronic lock engage, a small, clean, cold sound, stamping the truth into place. I had been excluded from my own home by a system that required no argument. I stepped back from the porch. The rain kept falling. The neighbors stayed silent. The camera kept watching. I touched the medical folder inside my coat, felt the stiff edge of paper press against my chest. I thought of the trust documents from years ago. I thought of my own signature, the ink of a man who once believed family was the strongest structure of all. And as I turned my back and left Ashford Lake, I no longer saw myself as only a victim. I saw that I had stepped into a game with rules already written. I didn't yet know what they were written with: paperwork, signatures, medical statements, or phrases that sounded very kind. But I knew Eleanor had loved me enough to prepare an exit, and if I had signed something at her request, then somewhere in that pile of seemingly harmless documents, there was still another door, one they hadn't locked yet. I returned to Ashford Lake around noon that day, not because I hoped the door would open, but because there were things inside that house I had never imagined letting anyone else touch. The rain had stopped. The lake was calmer, pale light spreading over the stone path like a thin layer of dust. I walked slowly, unhurried. After being pushed out that morning, I understood that haste would only make me look like someone who had lost his way. I needed to look like myself, even if only the shadow of the man who once lived here. The camera was still there, quietly watching. I no longer looked up at it. The thing staring hardest was not the lens, but the feeling that everything I once took for granted was being dismantled piece by piece, silently, without permission. I stood before the porch, took a breath deep enough to keep my chest from trembling. The front door was slightly open, as if someone had decided I should see this. Howard Beckett sat at the dining table by the large window, where Eleanor used to place a vase of flowers every morning. He was drinking coffee, not from just any mug, but from the white ceramic mug printed with the image of the first steel bridge I had consulted on, the project whose photo I kept in my office for years because it marked the first time people trusted me enough to give me real responsibility. That mug was not decorative memorabilia. It was a marker, and now it rested neatly in Howard's hand, his fingers wrapped around the handle as if it had belonged to him all along. Howard took a sip, set the mug down on its saucer, the soft but distinct clink of porcelain touching porcelain. He didn't look at me right away. He left me standing there at the threshold, long enough for me to understand exactly where I stood in this room. When he finally looked up, there was no surprise in his eyes, only something like habit, the habit of using other people's things without asking. "The coffee's still decent," he said, as if evaluating something that belonged to him, "but these beans are roasted a bit too dark." I looked at the mug. I didn't say that those beans were Eleanor's favorite, that she used exactly that amount of water, because she knew I couldn't tolerate bitterness that strong. I didn't say it because I realized explanations no longer mattered. The most refined humiliation needs no rebuttal. It only needs to be witnessed. I stepped half a pace forward. The wooden floor creaked very softly, the familiar sound of a house whose expansion I had calculated so it wouldn't creak loudly in winter. In the corner of the room, Brooke leaned against the kitchen counter. She was neatly dressed, her hair tied low, her wrist showing a slim gold watch. Eleanor's watch. I recognized it instantly, not because it was expensive, but because Eleanor had worn it every day for the last 10 years, so much so that the small scratch along the edge was known only to me. Brooke turned her wrist, the metal catching the noon light, looking like an everyday accessory. No memory, no history, just jewelry. "It suits me," Brooke said lightly, as if testing the room's reaction. Nathaniel stood beside her. My son looked polished, in a light-colored shirt, sleeves rolled just right. He looked at the watch, then at me. His gaze passed over me without stopping. He didn't say right, and he didn't say wrong. He chose silence. And in that moment, I understood. This silence wasn't fear. It was choice. He chose to let the things that once belonged to his mother be used as shared property, as long as they didn't disrupt the new order. I stood there, in the familiar room, watching each detail have its meaning altered. The dining table was still the dining table, but Eleanor's chair had been pushed back, making room for Howard. The bookshelf was still the bookshelf, but a few volumes were misaligned, as if someone couldn't be bothered to keep them straight. Small changes, scattered, enough to deliver a clear message. This place had a new owner, and that owner didn't need to say it out loud. The sound of a cart's wheels came from the porch. The mail carrier stopped at the door, looking inside through the glass. He was young, a familiar face. I used to greet him every morning when I was healthy. He held a large envelope with my name printed clearly on it. He looked at me, then at Nathaniel, his eyes hesitating for a second. I saw the moment he decided who he should hand it to. "Mail for Mr. Caldwell," he said, uncertain. Howard set the mug down and stood. "I'll take it," he said, as if it were obvious. The mail carrier turned to me, waiting for a signal. Before I could speak, Brooke stepped forward, smiling very thinly. "My father-in-law isn't stable right now," she said, loud enough for someone outside to hear. "We're handling it." The mail carrier nodded and handed the envelope to Nathaniel. Before turning away, he glanced at me once more. A quick, embarrassed look, like someone who had just placed something in the wrong hands and didn't dare correct it. As he left, I heard the wheels roll away, taking with them what should have been mine to receive. Howard chuckled softly. "Less trouble," he said, then turned to Nathaniel. "Those papers should be kept tidy. He gets confused easily." I looked at my son. Nathaniel bent down and placed the envelope on the table, right beside the steel bridge mug. He didn't object. He didn't ask if I wanted to see it. He simply complied, the movement smooth, like someone accustomed to managing another person's affairs. "You should rest, Dad," Nathaniel finally said, his voice even, neither high nor low. "These things, we'll handle them." I heard every word clearly. These things. Not the house. Not Mom's belongings. Not your rights. Just these things. A vague category broad enough to push me aside without explanation. I turned to look at Brooke. She rotated her wrist once more, the watch catching the light. "Don't worry," she said. "We're keeping everything in order. You don't need to carry the burden anymore." "Burden," I repeated in my mind. A light word, but placed just right, it weighed like stone. Howard lifted the mug again and took a small sip. He looked at me over the rim, his eyes mixed with assessment and cheap pity. "You understand," he said. "Everyone reaches a point where they need to lighten the load." I looked at the mug, the watch, the envelope, the objects that once carried their own stories, now arranged as evidence of a single truth. I had been turned into a burden inside the very space I created. This humiliation didn't need shouting. It was laid out neatly on the dining table, under the noon light, in front of the people who once called me family. The afternoon drifted through the house in thin light, stretching human shadows across the wooden floor into pale gray streaks. I stood in the living room, exactly where my first structural drawing used to hang, the one I kept as a reminder that everything solid needs a foundation. Now that spot held a generic decorative painting. No one explained. No one asked my opinion. I understood. Some things are taken down not because they are ugly, but because they remind people who the real owner used to be. Nathaniel walked to the dining table and set down a dark leather-bound folder. No extra noise, no rushed movement. The way he placed it was identical to how he used to prepare for project meetings when he worked with me, except for one thing. This time, the person sitting across from him was no longer a partner, but his father. On the first page, the words power of attorney were clearly visible, neat and cold, like a label. I looked at those words and realized that in this house, everything had already been arranged to move forward without me. Brooke stood at the kitchen counter, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was steady, low, precise, the kind people use when speaking to a bank, not to family. "Yes, he was just discharged," she said. "There are medical notes. We just want to make sure the accounts aren't interrupted." A brief pause. She listened, then nodded. "Correct. The authorization is already in effect." The call wasn't meant for me to hear, but every word was chosen so I would understand. I was no longer the one directly managing my own life. I was just the reason someone else needed to step in and help. Nathaniel pulled out a chair and sat down. Familiar gestures, straightening the papers, placing his elbows just right, leaning slightly forward. I had seen this posture hundreds of times, on nights when he asked me about load limits and stress tolerances. Back then he looked at me. Today his eyes avoided mine. "You should sit," Brooke said without turning around. "The doctor advised against agitation." Howard stood behind me, his hand hovering over the back of the chair, not touching, but close enough to make it clear I no longer had a choice. I pulled the chair back and sat. The wooden floor creaked softly under my weight, a familiar sound that today felt different, like confirmation that I was following instructions. Brooke ended the call, set the phone down, and took a slim metal pen from her bag. She placed it in front of Nathaniel, not in front of me. A small detail, but enough to define roles. The pens I used were always heavy, solid, meant for signatures that carried weight. This pen was light, smooth, chosen for signing quickly and without looking back. "It's just a formality," Brooke said, "so everything runs smoothly." I looked at my son. "What are you about to sign?" Nathaniel inhaled and exhaled as if rereading a carefully prepared script. "You just got out of the hospital. The medical file says you need recovery time. This is only temporary." "Temporary?" I repeated in my mind, a word soft enough to accept, vague enough to stretch indefinitely. Nathaniel turned the page. Dense clauses appeared, familiar legal language, the kind whose weight I understood very well. I knew what doors a power of attorney could open if activated at the right moment, and I knew why it could be used today. A hospital discharge, an unfinished diagnosis, a few notes sufficient to turn caution into control. "You don't need to worry," Nathaniel said evenly. "Everything is still in your name. I'm just handling things for you." I looked at his hand, the hand once cracked from cold when he followed me onto job sites, once trembling with fear of ruining his first drawing. Now that his hand rested on the paper, ready to replace me with his signature. No shaking, no hesitation. "Can I sign it myself?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Brooke shook her head very slightly. "It's not advisable. The doctor said you're easily agitated. We don't want to risk." Risk. A tidy word, enough to wrap my autonomy up and set it aside. Nathaniel leaned down. The pen tip touched the paper. In that moment, I waited for him to stop. I waited for a glance. I waited for a question. Nothing happened. The ink slid smoothly, decisively. My son's signature appeared, followed by the words "attorney in fact," in the space meant for the representative. The only sound in the room was the pen scratching across paper. Short, cold, done. When Nathaniel set the pen down, I didn't feel pain. I felt empty, not because I lost the right to sign, but because I had just been removed from the role of father in the cleanest way possible. No argument, no conflict, just a procedure completed in front of me, as if my presence existed only to legitimize that moment. "All set," Brooke said, gathering the papers and slipping them neatly back into the leather folder. "Things will be easier now." Easier for whom? No one needed to answer. Nathaniel stood up, avoiding my eyes. "You should rest, Dad," he said. "You need quiet." I stayed a few more seconds, looking at the signature not yet dry. I remembered teaching him that every signature is a responsibility, that putting pen to paper means accepting consequences. I once believed he understood, and I realized he did understand very well. Only this time, the consequences weren't his. When I walked out of the room, I carried the feeling that I had just witnessed a son replace his father with a stack of papers, and do it with the terrifying calm of someone convinced he was doing the right thing. That night, I didn't sleep at all, not because my head still throbbed from the days in the hospital, but because the fragments of words from the day kept quietly fitting together, aligning far too smoothly. The house was dark, the hallway light stretching thin streaks across the wooden floor like footprints not yet erased. I sat in the chair by the window where Eleanor used to read, and let my memory open another door, one I had ignored before because I trusted people. Brooke surfaced in my memory by her voice rather than her face. One afternoon a few months earlier, when I was still driving myself, still signing papers, still the one making the final decisions, she sat across from Nathaniel at the dining table, gently turning her glass, asking as if discussing the weather. Whether in an emergency situation there was a way to handle things quickly, without lengthy delays. Nathaniel had asked her to clarify, and Brooke smiled, perfectly natural. Emergency guardianship, just to avoid complications. At the time, I was in the next room, overheard it vaguely and dismissed it as the caution of someone used to weighing risks. Looking back now, that question was not hypothetical. It was a marker clearing the path. The memory slid onward. I saw Nathaniel in his office, the screen glowing, long lines of legal text scrolling past. He was speaking to someone, voice lowered, choosing words carefully. Medical records were needed. A situation urgent enough was needed. Then he nodded, like someone who had just been told what piece was missing. A situation. The word now sounded cold, neat, precise, like a period already placed on a calendar. 2 weeks, only 2 weeks before I returned to Ashford Lake, the emergency filing had been submitted, attached with notes about concerns regarding capacity, excerpted from older medical records. No permission sought, no questions asked. It simply sat there, waiting to be invoked. I didn't know this when I stood before the locked door. I only felt myself being evaluated, every movement, every step, as if someone were waiting for a misstep. The next morning, I walked down the hallway to get some water. Howard appeared at the far end, hard-soled shoes, slow steps. He said something that sounded like concern. The floor was slippery. I should be careful. I nodded, my hand resting on a chair. I was used to keeping my balance. But just as I turned into the narrow corner leading to the side hall, with my hand only loosely gripping the chair back, I felt a very clear pressure from behind my left shoulder. Not hard, not violent, just a short, clean, deliberate push, precisely enough to break the balance of a body not yet fully recovered from days in a hospital bed. There was no rough collision, just a perfectly timed moment as my weight shifted, my foot slipping off its support, my knee buckling, my body pitching toward the wooden floor like an accident already arranged. My body slid. Cold wood pressed against my back. A brief flash of light. I heard Brooke's small cry, Nathaniel calling my name, everything unfolding fast and clean, like a rehearsed scene. When I opened my eyes, I was on the floor, staring at a ceiling I knew yet felt distant from. Warm blood ran at my temple, leaving a dark streak on the wood. "You shouldn't walk alone," Brooke said, kneeling, her voice trembling just enough. Nathaniel already had his phone in hand. "Call an ambulance," he said, not asking. Howard stepped back half a pace, hands open as if to show he stood outside it all. I looked into his eyes. No panic, just a calculation completed. The ambulance arrived. The paramedics asked what I remembered. I said I slipped, not because I didn't understand what had happened, but because I knew saying otherwise would only send the story in a direction that worked against me. Brooke produced a prepared folder. Nathaniel signed confirmation. Everything moved forward with chilling efficiency. At the hospital, the doctor wrote a brief note. Recent stroke history. Fall due to loss of balance. Observation required. A line thin enough to fit neatly with the application already waiting. That was when I understood the fall wasn't the beginning. It was the final piece. Lying under the white lights, I reached the bottom of something I couldn't quite name. Not fear, but recognition. Recognition that an ethical boundary had been crossed in silence. Someone had decided that taking my rights was necessary, and once a goal is labeled necessary, every means becomes permissible. The moral bottom is not loud. It arrives as a push just strong enough, a document filed in advance, and a story told so smoothly there is no room left for the truth. When I closed my eyes, I knew I was no longer facing a worried family, but a plan that had entered its next phase, and this time it was called legitimization. The gate of silver willows slid open with a soft, controlled sound, the kind designed not to startle anyone. 2 pale stone pillars stood parallel, topped with a matte metal nameplate, the letters deeply engraved, looking like a promise of safety. I looked at the name as the car stopped, and realized this place did not need high walls or steel fences. Everything was locked by procedure. The hallway was long, evenly lit, carrying a faint scent of disinfectant, diluted to the point of emotional neutrality. The floor was not glossy to prevent slipping. Chairs were spaced at precise intervals, neither too close nor too far apart. Here, even the distance was standardized. A staff member pushed a cart of paperwork past us, didn't look at me, only nodded to Brooke. Nathaniel walked behind, silent, as if silence itself were proof he had done nothing wrong. We stopped at a reception desk where a thick gray folder lay open, my name printed clearly at the top corner. A woman in a light blue uniform opened the file, flipped to the first page, and began reading aloud without looking at me, without asking for confirmation. Confused, she read, agitated, unsafe to live alone. Each word was pronounced clearly, evenly, like items on a checklist. I stood there listening to those adjectives being attached to me, feeling as if someone were labeling an object meant to be processed. "Sweetie," she said, finally looking up with a thin smile, "you'll be just fine." No first name, no last name. Not Everett, just a false term of endearment, gentle enough to demean without being considered rude. I opened my mouth to correct her, but Brooke stepped half a pace forward, resting her hand on the edge of the desk. "He gets easily agitated," she said softly but firmly. "That's what the doctor advised." The woman nodded and added another line. She did not ask if I agreed. She did not ask how I felt. At Silver Willows, consent had already been submitted. They guided me down another hallway. The door opened with a key card. Inside was a clean room, neatly made bed, small dresser, window overlooking a lawn trimmed perfectly flat. Nothing was wrong, and that was what made it frightening. Everything was just adequate enough to prevent complaint, and therefore no one had the right to demand more. Back at the desk, the file was turned to the next page. "We need verification," the woman said, sliding an ink tray toward me. "Fingerprint here." "What about my signature?" I asked. "Not necessary," she replied. "The file indicates you have difficulty signing. This is the identity verification procedure in such cases." Difficulty? I looked at my hand, the hand that had signed hundreds of blueprint pages and dozens of contracts without ever shaking. Now it was being asked to press into ink, a way of simplifying a human being into a print. I hesitated for a beat. Brooke tilted her head. Nathaniel stared at the floor. No one urged me because they knew I had no other option. My finger touched the ink, cold and damp, then pressed onto the paper. The fingerprint appeared, dark and clear. No one looked at me then. The fingerprint was considered sufficient. "Thank you, sweetie," the woman said, collecting the paper. "We'll take good care of you." care, a beautiful word used to conceal the removal of rights. I was given a plastic wristband, my name printed small, a clear identification number beside it. No one asked if I wanted to wear it. It was snapped onto my wrist with a soft click, a small sound marking the completion of the transfer, from homeowner to managed file. They led me to the communal dining room where several people sat with vacant expressions, spoons tapping bowls in steady rhythm. A staff member placed a meal tray in front of me. "Eat up so you stay strong," she said, her voice high and slow, as if speaking to a child. I looked at the tray, then at her. "My name is Everett," I said clearly. She smiled without correcting herself. "Does Sweetie need anything else?" My name drifted away without touching anything. The afternoon at Silver Willows stretched on without edges. Everything moved by schedule. Medication time, walking time, rest time. Soft chimes sounded, gentle reminders repeated long enough for a person to forget they once had the right to refuse. In the evening, Brooke and Nathaniel stopped by, standing in the doorway without fully entering. "Is it okay here?" Nathaniel asked, the question asked to fulfill obligation, not to receive an answer. "For now," I said. Brooke nodded, satisfied. "We feel more at ease," she said. "The system here is good." The system. I looked at the band on my wrist, the schedule board on the wall, the small camera mounted high in the corner of the room. A system does not require malice. It only requires procedure, and once procedure is running, people are processed as cases. When they left, the door closed softly. No loud lock, just a brief beep. I sat on the bed, hands resting on my thighs, feeling my breathing slow, not from peace, but from the absence of any space to resist. At Silver Willows, humiliation did not come from harsh words. It came from being called by a name that was not mine, from being fingerprinted instead of signing, from listening to someone read my file as if reciting the weather. This was humiliation without shouting, where every document followed protocol. Every smile was polite, and therefore no one was responsible when a human being was made to disappear a little at a time. I lay back, staring at the smooth white ceiling, and understood that from this moment on, what I was facing was no longer just my family, but an entire system designed so it would never have to listen to me speak. At Silver Willows, no one injects anything recklessly. Everything moves along a straight, clean path, ending with a signature at the bottom of the page. That morning, a metal cart stopped outside my room, its rubber wheels rolling so quietly they were almost unnoticeable. On the tray were small medication cups in different colors, neatly arranged in order. No syringes, no rough handling, just dosage as prescribed. The nurse read my name, this time my full name, in a neutral voice. "Medication time." She set a cup of water on the table and slid the tray closer. I asked what they were. She checked the chart and answered with familiar phrases. Mood stabilizer, reduces agitation, helps with deeper sleep. Each phrase was safe, sufficient to quiet questions. I swallowed, not because I trusted them, but because here, refusal was also something that had to be documented. Around noon, Brooke appeared in the doctor's office. I wasn't there, but later, piecing things together, I understood how the conversation unfolded. She called someone she knew, a doctor who had followed my case before, and used exactly the tone the system needed to hear. "Stability is the priority," she said. "He becomes easily agitated in a new environment. We just want to avoid risk." No one lied. They simply emphasized the most convenient lines in the file. A recent minor stroke, a fall. The word agitated already on record. That was enough. In the afternoon, the second dose arrived. No lengthy explanation, just a new bullet point on the chart. I took it and felt the change arrive not like a blow, but like a thin fog settling over my thoughts. The sharp edges in my mind softened. Time stretched. I remember meaning to stand and walk to the window, then forgetting why. By evening, the meal placed in front of me looked the same as lunch, but the taste felt farther away. I heard spoons against bowls, heard someone being called sweetie at the next table, but the sounds reached me as if through thick glass. I knew where I was, but I was no longer sure how I had gotten there. When I asked the time, the nurse answered gently, "Almost rest time." A reply that wasn't wrong, just not what I asked. The next day, the doctor stopped by. He stood at the foot of the bed, checking the chart, not sitting. "Do you feel anxious?" he asked. I meant to talk about the paperwork, the signatures, the fall in the hallway, but my words moved more slowly than my thoughts. By the time I finished the sentence, he was already writing. "Seems more stable," he said, circling a box. Stable, a beautiful word, sufficient to justify the next dose. Brooke visited late in the afternoon. She sat near the bed, set her bag on the chair, asked if I was sleeping well. I nodded. I wasn't sure if I slept or simply sank under. "Good," she said, satisfied. "The doctor says that's progress." I looked at her face, trying to find an opening to say something that mattered, but my thoughts lined up sluggishly, unwilling to push forward. The days that followed moved to the same rhythm. Morning medication, midday medication, evening medication, each dose named, timed, signed for, with no error to contest. I began to forget small details. The old code to my front door, the name of the neighbor who once asked me to inspect his wooden bridge. I still remembered the big things, but they felt distant, like looking through water. When I tried to say I didn't need more, the nurse smiled and noted, "Patient anxious." One morning I looked at myself in the mirror of the shared bathroom and realized my eyes were slower. Not sad, not afraid, just slow. I understood then that the most dangerous thing about over-medication wasn't pain, but making resistance exhausting. When someone is no longer sharp enough to object, every decision starts to look reasonable. That night, I lay listening to the air conditioning breathe steadily. The ceiling was no longer flat white like it had been the first day. The edges blurred. I knew I was being guided along proper procedure, by medications as prescribed, by people who believed they were doing the safest thing. And in that thin fog, I understood one more truth. To strip a person of their rights without leaving a bruise, all you have to do is call it care, and place a priority, labeled stability, above everything else. At Silver Willows, time does not move by clocks. It moves by medication trays, by the sound of a cart stopping outside the door, by silences repeated long enough for a person to forget how they once measured days at all. The watch I wore, the only old possession they had not yet taken, had stopped at some point. Not because it was broken, but because I was no longer allowed to know the time. That morning I brought the watch down to the nurse's station. The steel case was lightly scratched, the leather strap softened by years of use. The attendant looked at it, then at me, with the measuring gaze of someone pricing an item not listed on any inventory. "I need to make a call," I said quietly. 10 minutes. She hesitated. Here, every exception required a reason. I placed the watch on the counter and nudged it forward, a silent exchange we both understood. She nodded, wrote something in the log, and led me to the wall-mounted phone at the end of the hallway, an old model with a coiled cord, positioned far enough away that no one could hear clearly. I called Malcolm Pierce. He answered on the second ring, his voice familiar, steady, alert, the voice of someone still outside the system. I didn't tell the whole story. I said only what mattered. Silver Willows, power of attorney, and a number that surfaced in my mind like a cold needle. "Check the consulting account," I said. "Now." 10 minutes was not enough for pleasantries or explanations. It was enough to trigger a chain reaction I had built over years, back when I learned how to make money move only when it had a reason. Malcolm went quiet for a few seconds. I heard faint keyboard taps on the other end. "Which account?" he asked. "The Ashford Bridge consulting account," I replied. "The one not used for personal expenses." I heard his breathing shift, slightly, just enough to tell me something was wrong. "There's a transfer," Malcolm said. $412,000. Split into 2 transactions. No prior notice. I closed my eyes. The number appeared clean and steady. 412,000, not the whole amount, not large enough to trigger automatic alerts, just enough to look like operating costs if someone chose the timing well. I asked for the recipient. "Beckett Development, LLC," Malcolm answered. "Domestic transfer. Reason listed as consulting services." Howard Beckett. The name closed a circle I had seen forming but hadn't yet connected. I remembered his talk of projects, of cash flow needing to be flexible, of advances to keep momentum, the steel bridge mug on the dining table. Everything snapped into place. "Timing?" I asked. "Immediately after the POA took effect," Malcolm said. "Electronic signature. Valid." Valid. A word I knew well. Many wrong things in life don't need to be illegal. They only need enough paperwork. "Leave it," I said. "Don't block it. Don't call anyone." Malcolm understood. He didn't ask why. We had worked together long enough to know when money should be allowed to go, and when it should come back carrying a trail. As I finished speaking, footsteps sounded behind me. The attendant stood at the end of the hallway, not approaching but close enough to remind me I was being timed. "You have 10 minutes, she said, politely procedural. I gripped the receiver and lowered my voice. "One last thing," I told Malcolm. "Has that consulting account been touched before?" He said no. This was the first transfer. Clean, precise, deliberate. When I hung up, the 10 minutes were over. The attendant returned, glanced at the watch on the counter, and slid it back to me. "Just this once," she said. I took it, feeling its familiar weight. The watch wasn't running, but it had done exactly what it needed to do. Back in my room, I sat on the bed and let the number 412,000 settle. Money doesn't disappear with noise. It leaves quietly, by procedure, through doors already open. And when it goes the right way, people rarely look back, but I did. That consulting account wasn't living money. It was clean flow, kept separate to track every dollar like a measurement line where any deviation leaves a mark. Howard hadn't taken everything because people who understand money never drain an account. They take just enough to test, just enough to see whether anyone is still watching the statements. At Silver Willows, they believed I was foggy, that medication had slowed me, that a man labeled unsafe to live alone wouldn't be sharp enough to follow numbers. They forgot one thing. Some things don't live in short-term memory. They live in habit. That evening, Brooke visited, asked if I was eating, if I was sleeping. I answered just enough for the visit to end smoothly. Nathaniel didn't come, and neither did Howard. I looked at my wrist. The watch stood still, its hands unmoving. But inside me, another rhythm had begun. The money was gone, and because it went the right way, it left a very clear path for the day I would return. Night at Silver Willows fell very gently, as if this place did not allow darkness to startle anyone. The hallway lights dimmed gradually, washing the walls in a thin glow, just bright enough to make everything look calm. I sat on the bed with my back against the cold wall, the plastic wristband resting quietly around my wrist, like a reminder. The medication had slowed my thinking, but not my hearing. My ears still caught every sound, more clearly than during the day. The door was slightly ajar. Outside, at the nurse's station, someone stopped. I recognized Nathaniel's voice from the first sentence. Low, clipped, free of excess emotion. He did not step into my room. He did not say my name. He spoke to the facility manager in the tone of someone discussing work, strictly by protocol. "Don't change the regimen," Nathaniel said. "My father does well when he sleeps." The sentence landed in the clean air. Not venomous, not harsh. Just a confirmation placed at exactly the right moment. I stared at the ceiling where the light formed a narrow strip. "Does well when he sleeps." Those 4 words sat there, complete and sealed, like a stamp just pressed. The manager replied in a practiced voice. "Noted. Nighttime indicators are stable." That's all we need, Nathaniel said. Priority is maintaining rhythm. Avoid disruption. Maintain rhythm. Avoid disruption. Two phrases sufficient to shut any remaining open door. I understood perfectly. This call was not meant for me. It was meant for the file, and a file does not need to hear me speak. I shifted slightly and looked through the gap in the door. Nathaniel stood with his back to my room, coat neat, phone pressed to his ear. His posture was solid, familiar, the posture of someone convinced he was doing the reasonable thing. The manager nodded and wrote. No one glanced in my direction. No one needed to know whether I could hear or not. There were a few moments of agitation during the day, the manager said. Handled, Nathaniel replied, as long as nights are calm. Calm nights. I closed my eyes for a beat, letting the phrase pass through me. Calm meant quiet. Quiet meant no objections. No objections meant no need for adjustment. The call ended with courtesy, just enough. Thank you for coordinating. We'll continue to monitor. Words so proper they left no mark. Nathaniel put the phone away, turned, and walked off in another direction, not toward my room. I lay back as the medication pulled my eyelids down. In my head, everything slowed, but the meaning sharpened. I was not being hurt. I was being kept calm. No violence was needed when there was a regimen. No locks were needed when there was a medication schedule. Everything was legal. Everything was gentle. A nurse walked past, glanced into my room, adjusted the blanket. Sleep well, she said softly. I opened my mouth to speak, to say I had heard, to say I was not fine. But my words arrived slower than my thoughts. She was already gone. The hallway lights dimmed another notch. Somewhere a door closed quietly. At Silver Willows, humiliation does not require cruelty. It comes from the most important decisions about you being made in a phone call, where you are the subject, not the participant, cold, lawful, and therefore requiring no apology. As sleep finally took hold, I understood that the lowest point is not screaming or panic. It is the moment when you can still hear, still understand, still be awake. But others have decided that your awareness is no longer necessary, and that is enough. Night at Silver Willows operates differently from daytime. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps, fewer eyes. The night shift is always given a reassuring name, light supervision. But in reality, there is only one nurse on duty, one security guard making rounds on a fixed schedule, and everything else left to the system. And the system trusts lights, keycard doors, and cameras. And cameras, like people, sometimes see nothing. I knew that wasn't accidental. 3 days earlier, when a maintenance cart stopped in the north hallway, I had overheard a brief exchange. The laundry area camera was malfunctioning, waiting on a replacement part, temporarily marked offline. A thin report, signed quickly, enough to legitimize a blind spot. At Silver Willows, blind spots are not called vulnerabilities. They are called being addressed. That night, medication was distributed earlier than usual, a way to make the night shift easier. I swallowed but kept one pill under my tongue, letting the bitterness keep me alert. The wall clock in the hallway read a little past 2 in the morning, the hour when every schedule slows down except the laundry cart. The cart rolled out of the laundry area on time. Old metal frame, worn rubber wheels, the smell of detergent mixed with damp fabric. The night attendant pushed it alone, headphones in, steady pace, head down. I had watched that route many times from my room, through the north hallway, turn left, pass through the service door to the collection area. The route passed directly through the camera marked offline. I opened my door very slowly. The hinges made no sound, a small detail I had noticed from the first day. The hallway was empty, night lights dimmed low. I stepped out, kept my breathing even, stayed close to the wall. The gray robe blended with the pale lighting. No rush. Rushing is the only thing that draws attention. The laundry cart stopped, briefly, so the lid could be adjusted. I stepped into the shadow behind it, where the light didn't hit directly. When the lid opened, I slid inside, pulled the thick fabric over myself. The damp smell rushed in, heavy but familiar, the smell of work that needs to be done but no one wants to see. I stayed silent, heart slow, every movement small. The cart rolled on. The wheels bumped lightly over the threshold of the service door. I heard the door close behind us, not the main lock, just the safety latch. Outside, the air was colder. I counted the rolls, 1, 2, 3. Then the cart stopped. The attendant pulled it into the collection area, parked it against the wall, checked the schedule board, nodded to himself, and walked away. He didn't look back. Here, people trust procedure. Procedure said the cart had arrived, and that was enough. I waited a few more beats. When the footsteps faded, I pushed the lid up just enough and slid down to the ground. My knees touched the cold concrete. I stood, adjusted the robe, took a deep breath. The collection area was empty. The side door leading to the service path opened by card, but the night shift often left the outer latch unsecured for deliveries. Another being addressed. I stepped out. Night wind moved through, carrying the smell of damp leaves. No moon, no camera saw me leave, because the camera here had been officially logged as broken. The maintenance report sat somewhere in a file, already signed, enough to stop any question before it started. I didn't run. I followed the narrow path along the fence, avoiding the light of the main gate. Every step had a reason. I left Silver Willows not by force, but through legitimate gaps in the system. Gaps that, at the right moment, were wide enough for a person to pass through. When the building disappeared completely behind me, I stopped and looked back once. No flashing lights, no alarms, no one calling my name. In this place, disappearance happens so quietly that no one thinks anything has happened at all. I pulled up my collar and walked into the night. A night without cameras, and for the first time in days, I knew I was moving according to my own decision. I didn't go straight into the city after leaving Silver Willows. A person recently declared incapacitated, appearing downtown in the middle of the night would only trigger more reports. I followed the service route to a secondary parking area where early morning delivery trucks usually stopped. It was cold, but my mind was clear enough to know I needed to drop off the radar before appearing anywhere that required paperwork. I caught an early ride and got off at the Southern Waterfront District, an area with fewer traffic cameras and many small offices that opened at dawn. I swapped the robe for an old jacket I had hidden earlier, washed my face at a gas station, and waited until the city woke up into its normal rhythm. No one looked at me like a man on the run. I looked like an older man out early because that's what he was used to. When it was fully morning, I finally called Malcolm. Not by text, not through anyone else. I gave him an address, a time, and one sentence only. I'm out. Malcolm didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Then come straight here." I met Malcolm Pierce in a small office overlooking the city's southern waterfront. No large sign, no polished reception area, just a frosted glass door, a dark wooden desk, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, sharp enough to sustain a long conversation. I walked in while it was still early. Malcolm was already there, sleeves rolled up, files laid open. He didn't ask how I had arrived, or where I had just come from. He looked at me for a beat, and then lowered his gaze to the paperwork. "Sit," he said. "We have work to do." That was always Malcolm's way of working, skipping questions that didn't help. He turned a page, tapped the edge of the desk lightly, then looked at me for the first time with full focus. "I've reviewed everything," he said, "and there's something we need to say immediately." He slid an excerpt across to me. "The house at Ashford Lake," he said evenly. "It has never been titled in your son's name." I didn't ask him to repeat it. I simply exhaled once. After days of having everything twisted by language, stability, safety, protocol, the plain truth landed like a knock in exactly the right place. Malcolm continued without waiting for my response. "The owner is the Caldwell Family Trust," he said. "Irrevocable. It cannot be altered unilaterally. He paused, letting the words settle. I looked at the bold print in the corner of the page, the trust's name familiar like an old marker. Eleanor. I saw her in the evening kitchen light, turning pages, asking short, precise questions. Malcolm pulled another file forward. The trust was established at Eleanor Caldwell's request, he said. She set explicit conditions. The asset is to be held independently, not transferable by power of attorney. He flipped the page and pointed to a highlighted paragraph. Power of attorney has no authority to transfer title, encumber, or reassign ownership of assets held in this trust. POA only permits administrative handling within narrowly defined limits. I looked down at my hands. The emptiness from my days at Silver Willows suddenly had shape. Not a miracle, just a structure built correctly from the start. Malcolm went on, sentence by sentence, without drama. They can sign, he said. They can move consulting funds, if the account allows it. But they cannot take the house, and they cannot legitimize that by using a POA. He paused and took a sip of coffee. Guardianship? Emergency filing, I said. Malcolm nodded. Filed, yes, but it does not reach trust ownership. And there's one more thing. He slid over a thin sheet. This clause. Eleanor required independent notice to a secondary beneficiary if there was any attempt to interfere with core trust assets. Secondary beneficiary? I asked. You, Malcolm said, and a third-party overseer she designated. I stayed silent. Eleanor had left another door and handed the key to someone no longer living in that house. Malcolm looked up. They think you stopped watching, he said. They think the medication slowed you down, but files don't sleep. He turned the screen toward me. A timeline appeared. The date the POA went into effect. The date $412,000 was transferred. The date stable was noted at the facility, and a legal void where no document existed authorizing any action against the house. That void wasn't a weakness. It was a wall. What do we do? I asked. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He stacked the papers neatly, then said, We let them believe everything is calm. Don't block the money that's already gone. Don't warn them. Don't send letters. And? I asked. And we file a preservation request for the trust assets, he said, along with a notice of breach of fiduciary duty against anyone acting beyond their authority. Quiet. Precise. By the book. He looked at me longer this time. A POA is not a master key. It only opens the doors specifically listed. Anyone who uses it to open another door leaves fingerprints. I nodded. In my head, the scattered pieces aligned into a straight line. The fall, the regimen, the nighttime call, all designed to create the feeling of control. But ownership doesn't live in feelings. It lives in Eleanor's signature, a signature that had locked the right place. And Beckett Development LLC? I asked. Malcolm turned another page. The recipient of the consulting funds. Vague contract. But there's an audit on demand clause tied to the account holder. When the time comes, we invoke it. When? I asked. After they take one more step, Malcolm said. The biggest mistake usually happens when people think they've already won. I stood. Malcolm gathered the files and clipped them shut. He still didn't ask who I was in the system's eyes right now. He simply did what he always did. Read the paper, find the supports, apply pressure at the correct point. As I reached the door, Malcolm added quietly, Eleanor didn't leave a trap. She left a structure. I stepped outside, the waterfront wind carrying a faint smell of salt. For the first time in days, I didn't need to remind myself to stay sharp. The truth was standing upright, and where words still had force, their plan had just collided with a wall they never saw. Malcolm didn't call it a counterattack. He called it resetting the context. At the desk overlooking the waterfront, he laid the files out in 3 layers: legal, financial, and timing. No red arrows, no dramatic underlining, just parallel lines waiting for an intersection the other side would walk into on their own. We need them to sign voluntarily, Malcolm said evenly. No pressure, no bait. Just open the exact door they're already looking for. That door was called refinancing. That family was short on cash, not because they were poor, but because they had grown used to spending on borrowed rhythm, leverage stacked on leverage. Interest rates were up, maturities were closing in, and the earlier advances were no longer enough to cover the gaps. They needed a short-term bridge, clean on paper, fast enough for a bank to nod. Malcolm built that bridge through a private investment fund, real charter, real money, with one difference: oversight sat outside their reach. The fund carried neither my name nor Malcolm's. It stood under a neutral legal entity, administered by an independent trust company, the kind of structure Eleanor had trusted. The terms were clean, the language gentle. Short-term liquidity support for a company in restructuring, milestone-based disbursement, audit compliance. Nothing suspicious, especially to people who needed money urgently. The leverage was timing. Malcolm let the information leak at the right moment, not through the press, but through broker networks. There's a fund willing to bridge. The whisper moved faster than any formal invitation, and because they were used to everything flowing through paperwork, they believed this was just another step. They made the call. Malcolm didn't reach out. They did. The conversation was proper, polite, heavy with terminology. No one mentioned me. No one needed to. Terms were sent, commas adjusted, a few clauses refined, and a collateral appendix added. That appendix was the net. Any additional disbursement had to pass through a monitored operating account, with mandatory disclosure of use of funds. And then they signed themselves. $286,000 was not money. They thought they were giving away. It was a security deposit required by the fund's terms, a mandatory step to unlock a much larger refinancing package. When cash is tight, that number doesn't look like a loss. It looks like a prepaid key to make the bank door open. Under the appendix, the deposit was transferred from their own operating account into the fund's managed account, with a neat description: preparation and security fee. On paper, it wasn't wasted cost. It was proof of good faith, evidence of financial discipline worthy of further disbursement. Because they believed the amount would be credited back once refinancing closed, they signed quickly. Seamless electronic signature. Valid timestamp. No one rushed them. No one forced them. In their minds, this was a technical step to get money back, not to send money away. And that was precisely where the humiliation lived. They moved money while short on money with their own signature into a compliance structure where from that moment on, every dollar would be examined with no way back. What matters is that they did it willingly, Malcolm said as the number appeared on the screen, and they did it believing they were in control. The trap wasn't the amount. It was the path the money took. From that moment forward, every movement required reporting. Every withdrawal left a trace. And because they had entered a compliance structure, disclosure was no longer optional. It was an obligation. Malcolm stacked the files back together as neatly as he had opened them. Now we wait, he said. They'll keep behaving as before. Fast, convenient, trusting that signatures solve everything. I looked out at the water, the waves rolling evenly, no impact, no chase. A legal trap doesn't need fake bait. It only needs people to keep doing what they always do, sign, and let those signatures stand in the light. Public humiliation? I asked. Malcolm shook his head. We don't expose them. They'll expose themselves when mandatory reports are filed, when stated uses of funds are reconciled, when those fees have to be explained to the financial community. Humiliation doesn't come from words. It comes from statements. I nodded. At that point, there was nothing left to push. The structure was locked. Time would do the rest. As I was leaving, Malcolm added softly, "The law is one of the few traps people walk into willingly because they believe it's on their side." I stepped outside into the midday sun, reflecting off the water. Somewhere, a family had just signed a stack of papers they believed was an exit. They didn't know that from that moment on, every light was already on, and the public stage was only waiting for the right hour. I understood then that the story was no longer confined to offices or documents. It would surface where there was light, witnesses, and no way out. A few days later, I learned they were preparing a party, not through lawyers or filings, but through life itself. Whispered messages, photos of a staged venue circulating among neighbors, invitations sent with the confidence of people who believed everything was settled. When I saw those images, I knew the stage Malcolm had mentioned was already lit, and now it was only a matter of time before the curtain went up. My name wasn't on the list. I found out through a short message from an old neighbor, accompanied by a photo of the backyard of the Ashford Lake Villa being staged. The caption had only one line. They say it's a celebration. I read it, folded my phone shut. When people choose to celebrate in front of a crowd, they've already decided how they want to be seen. Everything else is just timing, waiting for the truth to step forward. That afternoon, sunlight angled across the lake. The breeze so light, the surface rippled into thin silver lines. The backyard was arranged neatly, tables and chairs set in a semicircle facing the water, sound and lighting rented as a package. The guests were exactly who you'd expect. Bankers, brokers, business partners, the neighbors who once looked away when I stood in front of my own door. Brooke moved between groups with a polished smile, her voice soft and steady. Nathaniel stood beside her, carrying the relaxed posture of someone who believed recent signatures had closed every risk. The music faded as they stepped onto the stage. Nathaniel took the microphone first, spoke about a difficult period, about the responsibility we had to shoulder, and then delivered the closing line, clear and complete, like a stamp pressed in front of the community. This house is mine. Brooke and her father followed, invoking stability, the future, a new beginning. Nods spread through the crowd. No one objected. The picture was nearly finished. Then the microphone cut out. No screech, no harsh feedback, just a hollow pause dropping into the yard. Nathaniel tapped the mic, turned to call the sound tech. Murmurs began. Brooke tightened her grip on her glass, her eyes flicking toward the control booth. Then a voice came through the system, not from the stage. "This is my house, not yours." The entire yard froze. The voice continued steady and slow. "You, your wife, and your father-in-law had me confined. You conspired to take this house. Unfortunately for you, you failed." Nathaniel went pale as recognition hit before he could locate the source. I stepped out from the sound booth, not rushing, not stopping, walking straight to the stage, each step long enough for every eye to register that the man they'd labeled unstable was standing there, clear-eyed and self-possessed. "My name is Everett Caldwell," I said when I reached the now live microphone. "I'm your father." I didn't raise my voice or dramatize anything. I simply laid out what had happened in the exact order it had been arranged for me. An emergency. Guardianship filing rushed through after my discharge. A medication regimen branded as stabilization that dulled my mind day by day, and a door locked behind me so legally no one thought to ask whether I agreed. I stopped there. No plea for sympathy, no demand for compassion. Just placed the truth where it belonged, so anyone willing to hear could hear, and no one could claim they hadn't. Nathaniel lunged for the mic, his voice cracking with anger. I didn't dodge. I cut him off with one sentence, enough to end it. "My condolences. This house is no longer in your name." The backyard seemed to crystallize. I went on, slower. "The villa is held in trust. It cannot be sold. It cannot be leveraged." Brooke staggered, bracing herself against the table. I wasn't finished. "The money," I said, "is no longer where you think it is." I read out the amount, the date, the transaction description. At the edge of the crowd, professionals reacted on instinct. A real estate broker quietly closed his leather notebook and stepped back. Not out of fear, but because he understood that from this moment on, everything tied to that house could become evidence. A banker stared at his phone longer than usual, then put it away without a word, realizing he was standing too close to a story that had just turned radioactive. "And this is the debt," I continued, not fixing on any single face. $738,000, including short-term loans, accrued interest, and penalties for violating fund covenants. I paused long enough for the number to land on everyone present. No collateral left, no cash flow to roll, and as of tonight, no one here can pretend that isn't true. They reacted the only way they had left, calling me confused, claiming I'd escaped care, accusing me of fabrication, voices rising, words tumbling. I didn't argue. I stepped back half a pace. My attorney stepped forward and read the notice. No commentary, no emotion. Ownership confirmed, power of attorney void, transactions under investigation, debt validated. Each line shut another door. I returned to the mic one last time. "I don't need to explain," I said. "Those who need to know already do." I looked straight at them. "As for you, now you'll work with the police." My attorney gave a small nod toward the gate, a subtle cue professionals recognize. Everything had been triggered in advance. No frantic calls, no coincidence. The signal went out the moment the documents were read. The sheriff's office arrived to serve papers and conduct a civil standby per filings, already on record, neither rushed nor delayed, enough to make clear this wasn't a threat, just the next prepared step. The party dissolved like a canvas pulled from its frame. No applause, no congratulations. I walked away in the sunset, carrying no keys, holding no glass. I left with the only thing I'd come to reclaim: my name. What followed no longer belonged to the party. It belonged to files, closed-door offices, and calls no longer answered with confidence. Nathaniel was taken into custody that night, not for words spoken on a stage, but for the trail of signatures he'd left over months: abuse of authority, financial exploitation, and falsified medical representations. Brooke wasn't cuffed on the spot, but she was ordered to surrender devices and records within 24 hours. Her transactions were frozen pending investigation. Her father left in silence, his face draining as counsel explained his exposure for complicities in fabricating records. Months of review followed, the quiet way the law works when it doesn't need spectacle. The guardianship was vacated, the power of attorney fully voided, transfers were ruled misapplied, remaining funds were frozen to offset obligations. The debt was confirmed in writing, $738,000, with a disposition schedule and personal liability attached. Nathaniel faced criminal charges. Brooke received civil sanctions and a long-term ban from asset management. No private settlement was accepted. This had crossed beyond family. The Ashford Lake Villa was restored to its proper place in the trust, under the original terms Eleanor set. No sale, no leverage, no winner by possession. The win was order restored. My part began with small things. I stayed in the lakeside house, the house that had never left my name, where mornings smell of damp wood and birds arrive on time. I let go of packed calendars, kept open afternoons. I walked the shoreline slowly, with nothing to prove. Neighbors who once looked away now nodded, hesitant but polite. I didn't reproach them, and I didn't revisit the story. My attorney sent a final email confirming closure. I read it and shut the laptop. There was no sense of victory, just a long, light breath. Life returned to its proper scale, no larger, no smaller, realigning what had been shoved out of place. That evening, with the lights on, I brewed tea and set a book on the familiar table. Outside, the lake lay flat, like a page finished and needing no edits. I sat there quietly with what the entire journey was for: my home, my name, and a life no longer pulled from my hands by someone else's greed. If you stayed with me to the end, there's one thing I'll say plainly. Some lives don't need revenge to close. only the truth placed where it belongs and people return to their proper positions. Justice here didn't arrive with shouting or spectacle. It came through patience, paperwork, and standing upright when others thought you'd fallen. If you've ever been misunderstood or pushed out of the life you built, leave a single so I know you understand that feeling. And if you want to keep listening to stories where justice doesn't have to scream to bring order back, I'd be grateful for your subscription. As a way we keep making room for the truth to stand.